Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the owner and founder of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and this is a platform where we provide free educational resources that enable your personal development for your subconscious mind. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Fearful Avoidant Attachment Style, also known as Anxious-Avoidant Attachment Style. So how do you stay with a person who comes from this attachment style, or how do you make the dynamic healthy, whether you're dating this person or whether you are this person yourself and you're just trying to navigate the waters of like what to do next in your relationship and how to create positive change? So first, you need to know a little bit about the depth of understanding of where this attachment style comes from and what it's all about. So first and foremost, usually somebody is of fearful avoidant or anxious avoidant attachment style. You're going to hear me refer to this as fearful avoidant throughout this video. Somebody is usually fearful avoidant because they have seen and been present in a lot of emotional chaos in the home. So usually this attachment style has a history of either physical, sexual, or just a lot of mental, emotional, verbal abuse in the household that they are exposed to over and over again. And they tend to be around this dynamics, of course, very, very early during the attachment style development ages. And usually this is like prolonged for just throughout their childhood life. So there's a lot of emotional turbulence that this young individual, as they're developing themselves, as they're growing and developing, that they're exposed to. And so what they take from this is that, relationships and connection are largely comprised of a lot of emotional distress and a lot of emotional chaos. So keep in mind, like the subconscious mind will form really early associations about things and then come to assume at a deeper level that this is what these things are all about. So for example, if somebody sees a ton of emotional chaos in the home or physical or sexual chaos in the home, then what this individual learns to believe is, hey, connection and relationships are about emotional chaos. These are the earliest associations that this attachment style makes in one form or another. So usually this attachment style has a fairly strong history of trauma, and not the type of trauma that we see just through emotional neglect, but more like, again, physical, mental, emotional abuse, sexual abuse kind of traumas. And out of this, they learn to really have a deep core wound around not being able to trust closeness and connection. Yet, there's not emotional neglect for this attachment style to not want connection altogether, sort of more like the dismissive avoidant attachment style. So they'll still hunger and desire for connection and closeness, but they won't trust it. So even times, like sometimes this attachment style comes from seeing just a lot of flip-flopping between parents in the relationship at home. Sometimes, one parent's like, oh, we're getting divorced, and then the other parent's like, no, we're not. And then, they go through these sort of cycles of repeating that parents say they're going to get divorced and sit down and tell the children, and then they retract that later on and say, oh, no, never mind. And there's a lot of this flip-flopping, which creates this like really unstable perception for what relationships are all about and how much connection is secure and lasting for this young individual exposed to these things. Or there can be just, much stronger, deeper issues here where one parent or one individual close to the family was sexually abusing the child or physically abusing the child, or again, like verbally, mentally, emotionally. And if this is the case, of course, this child learns like, okay, connection is not completely safe and I can't completely trust. It's unpredictable and uncertain. And so I hunger and I desire, but as people get closer and closer, I will push away or I will push back when things get too close. So when a fearful avoidant attachment style is with an anxious attachment partner, they tend to become more avoidant. They tend to like want to retract and pull back more and desire their space. And when this attachment style is with somebody who's dismissive avoidant, they tend to exhibit more of the anxious signs of this attachment pattern. So they'll tend to hunger more for closeness and try to pull in and not get rejected or abandoned or lose this person. But there's a lot of emotional turmoil in this attachment style because they don't trust completely and they don't feel secure in bonds. whatsoever, and yet they have like both sides where they're anxious and then they're also dismissive. It's like, come here, and then it's like, no, you're too close, get back. Wait, you're too far, come closer again. Oh wait, go away. There's sort of this like flip-flopping and this emotional chaos and turmoil they go through, which eventually can lead to like a lot of emotional outbursts for this attachment style. So you want to imagine they're sort of like always building up this emotional turmoil within them that's like, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too hot, it's too cold. And so eventually sometimes they'll blow up, or sometimes they'll really push away hard, or sometimes they'll, suddenly seem like they need to leave the relationship. And there are really deep underlying reasons for all of this. So on some level, this attachment style fears ever giving themselves over completely. Because similar to the dismissive avoidant, this attachment style feels like if they give themselves over completely, they're going to get ripped apart, or they're going to get really hurt and torn to shreds and just absolutely shattered. So it's like they want to get really close and they'll connect, and then they'll sort of always maintain this level of distance at the same time, and secrecy sometimes this attachment style will have, like sort of not being too vulnerable or too honest, especially about their feelings. Now, keep in mind, because this attachment style usually is coming from a space of a traumatic past, this attachment style also will be hyper sensitive to anything that resembles some kind of potential rejection, betrayal of trust, anything where there's lying or there's an incongruency. This attachment style like picks up on like this. And sometimes this attachment style will really keep this to themselves, because they'll sort of be like assessing everything. So let's say, for example, that you're the fearful avoidant, or let's say instead you're dating the fearful avoidant, and you're 5 minutes late from work, and the two of you live together, and you're home 5 minutes late from work. This attachment style might like sort of gather and collect information indirectly about why you're late from work, because they don't want to be vulnerable and express, hey, it scares me, this brings up stuff from my past, I feel that there's an incongruency, and I don't feel safe right now, can you tell me why you're late from work, and can you soothe me and connect to some of my feelings and emotions? Or they won't self-soothe completely either. So they're always sort of caught in this like limbo of no man's land, and so they tend to cope with all of their flip-flopping and back and forth feelings about really hungering for connection and closeness and fearing it and going sort of back and forth all the time. They tend to have a major coping mechanism where they will collect and gather and hoard information about what's actually going on. And as soon as that information seems to not match up completely, instead of expressing that they notice an incongruency, or instead of saying, hey, I'm afraid, or I'm triggered, or I'm going through some kind of insecurity here, instead, because they really don't want to be vulnerable, they'll just blow up and push away. And it will be over seemingly small or random things. And usually the things that are seemingly small and random that they're blowing up about or pushing you away about don't really have anything to do with what they're actually talking about when they do this. So if they say, oh, I don't want to go to your mother's for dinner on Friday. You know what? Let's just take space. I can't deal with this right now. And they push you away. Usually it wasn't about your mother's for dinner. Usually it was about 7 things that happened before that they didn't express about, whether it was incongruencies they saw, small forms of rejection that they felt, because again, they're sort of like coping with their fears in relationships and their wounds by gathering information and searching and hunting for incongruencies. And then when they find some, they'll sort of say to themselves, look, this reaffirms that connection is not safe and that I can't trust. And so they'll push away over those sorts of things. So you'll see that this attachment style appears really, really turbulent and sort of like emotionally volatile or irrational sometimes. And from the outside, from the person dating this attachment style, of course it seems this way. Like they seem to blow up over small and really random things. But for them internally, it's not random, and these things aren't small. A, these things are big triggers, and B, it wasn't usually the one thing that they're blowing up about. It was the sequence of information they had previously gathered that painted this picture for them that the relationship cannot be trusted or is not safe. And because, again, this attachment style usually is afraid of being vulnerable, they won't communicate until they're sort of pushing away. So what are the triggers for this attachment style? Well, as you can tell from what I've just shared, incongruencies are huge, again, because most people that come from trauma are hypersensitive to incongruencies, a dramatic shift in body language, change in tone of voice, micro expressions, all this stuff they're sort of picking up on, and they're gathering information to see, like, am I safe? Am I not safe? Can I trust? Can I not trust? And so incongruencies are huge. Lying is a huge trigger for this attachment style. If they kept you lying, it's just a great reaffirmation of that I can't trust and to push away. Or to become really, really anxious if you're with somebody, again, who might be really dismissive, as the fearful avoidant. They really need transparency. Like they'll be really triggered by a lack of explaining. Like if there seems to be a withholding of information, usually this attachment style will just assign the meaning that, oh, they're not expressing enough, or they're not sharing completely, so look, I can't trust, they're hiding something. And anybody who exhibits a lack of loyalty, or does anything that seems distrusting or untrustworthy, or anything, of course, that seems to threaten emotional or physical safety is huge, because it just sort of re-triggers these stored programs and patterns that they haven't necessarily resolved around trauma. So the needs, as you can tell, sort of based out of the triggers, strong need for congruency, strong need for trust, transparency. This attachment style needs communication, arguably more than any other attachment style, and that's a really bold statement. I want to say, in all fairness, it's really up to like the individual and other belief patterns and other things that they're carrying, but just as a general rule, it's super important for this attachment style to learn to communicate their fears and their experiences, and to ask for transparency instead of just assigning meaning to things. Like, seriously, your partner could have just been home 5 minutes late from work because of traffic, but if you see this and you're like, oh, look, this happens every Wednesday, I've noticed that he's always home 5 minutes late on Wednesdays, he's probably doing something bad after work on Wednesdays, or she's probably lying to me about where she actually is Wednesdays. Like, if you're doing that, you're hurting yourself, because you suffer in silence. You suffer by yourself. You carry all this fear. You want to bond and connect so badly, and yet you self-sabotage because you're so afraid of it at the same time. And instead of expressing and connecting to your partner, every time you don't express your fears or insecurities, you build walls instead. And so this attachment style has to be really mindful of breaking through these fears of vulnerability, because vulnerability, again, means the more vulnerable I am, the more you can hurt me. And that's like the subconscious association made, but that's not the case. The more vulnerable you are, the more clear you understand your own patterns, your own places where you're limiting yourself based on the past, your own places where you build walls between you and somebody you love. And it's not until you're clearly expressing and understanding these aspects of yourself that you can actually heal your attachment style. So for fearful avoidant, communicating is so key, and communicating from that vulnerable space. The other needs that they have, not just from their partner to communicate and themselves to communicate, but also they need clarity and expression. So sort of going under communication, but the more clear and specific both of you can be, whether you're the fearful avoidant or whether you're the person dating the fearful avoidant, the more clarity and openness and transparency, the better. And then the other huge need is for both parties to own their stuff. Like, usually fearful avoidant can be pretty good at saying like, hey, you know what, I screwed up. If there's a safe feeling of connection in the relationship, if their partner's also doing the same, or if they don't feel like they're going to be blamed when they express making a mistake, they're usually quite okay about saying sorry and taking ownership. And it's also really important to this attachment style that if you're dating them, you do the same. And lastly, like, sometimes they can be a little bit private and secretive. Because again, they're sort of collecting things and trying to assess the situation all the time, and can feel a deep fear of that vulnerability. And so sometimes an invasion of boundaries can be a bit of a trigger for this attachment style. And so the respecting of boundaries on both sides is quite important, just like for any human being, but maybe a little bit more specifically for this style of attachment. So how do you make changes? Well, number one, the best thing, if this is you or the person you're dating, the best thing you can do is introduce pure, vulnerable communication, mostly with I statements. So instead of saying, hey, you screwed up because you did this, this, and this, whenever we criticize somebody, there's actually a wish behind it. Whenever we criticize, there's usually something that we actually need behind it. So instead of saying, hey, you screwed up because you did this, this, and this, you might say, hey, when you did this, this, and this the other day, I felt X, Y, and Z. Or let me give a more clear example. Let's say that you live together and your partner never does the dishes. instead of saying, hey, what's wrong with you? You never do the dishes. You might say, hey, I'm feeling a little bit unsupported because I've noticed that I tend to do the dishes a lot more and I could really use some support. How would you feel about taking a turn? And when you're expressing like that from your feelings, there's a much greater chance at connection. There's a much greater chance at being heard from both parties and understood. And there's a much greater chance at change, because when we blame or criticize, our natural instinctual response is to shut down or to defend, because as children, when we're being socialized, usually criticism was followed by some form of punishment or shaming. So your brain goes into like almost fight or flight mode a little bit, and instead of actually being open and active and receptive to hearing what either party is expressing. So it's really important to encourage vulnerability from both parties and talk about what you're feeling and what you're needing, instead of just blaming each other for circumstances or situations, because you'll just sort of build these residual walls of resentment that way, and distrust further. So that's really important. This attachment style also so badly needs to dissect their stories, okay? It needs to check in with the meaning they're giving to things and question it. If you're this attachment style and your partner is home 5 minutes late from work on a Wednesday a couple times, so what will happen is you'll project meaning onto it based on your unresolved experiences from the past. So you might go, oh, just like my father, my partner is cheating. And you want to check in here, like, can you absolutely know that that's what the 5 minutes late means? And question this stuff, because otherwise, if we're not questioning it and separating from the meanings we're giving to things at a subconscious level, we're just projecting that onto our situation. We're suffering as if this is a reality. And even though we're just in the collecting data phase of trying to assess and discover, like, we need to talk about those things and question the meaning, as opposed to just automatically believe them, suffer accordingly, and become volatile as a result of these interpretations we're making about circumstances that are not necessarily an accurate depiction of the truth. So a huge and very important tendency or point here is to make sure that you're noticing the meaning you're giving to things when you see an incongruency. And instead of making, an incongruency or a shift in body language or a micro expression mean all these really terrible things, check in. Can I absolutely know that because my partner, sighed and walked away, that it means they're not interested in me anymore and they're going to reject and abandon me? Like, can you actually know that? Is it possible that they sighed and walked away because they're really tired, because they haven't slept enough, because they had a hard day at work, there could be so many other possibilities. But we tend, as this attachment style, to give really painful meaning to situations. When we notice all these incongruencies that we're already hypersensitive to, we tend to give meaning that's not a completely accurate depiction of what the actual reality is. And instead of just projecting meaning, we need to question within ourselves, and we need to ask our partners when we feel this way. This is one of the only ways to really heal this attachment style, is to say, hey, I noticed a change in your behavior right now. I'm afraid that it means X, Y, and Z, but can we talk about it? Because, I'm afraid that if I don't ask you, I'm just going to sit with this belief inside that it means something really terrible. And that's going to come back out in the relationship within the next few days. That fear and that emotion that I carry around this meaning that I just gave to your shift in body language, is going to sit with me, and it's going to come out somehow. Okay, so I feel like I'm sort of talking in such details here, and I should give more specific examples. So let's say you and your partner are sitting on the couch. You're the fearful avoidant. You see your partner suddenly freeze up and get nervous when you talk about your plans for next Friday, and maybe your partner has surprise plans for you for dinner or a movie or whatever, something special, and you sit there and you go, oh, their body language just changed. They're hiding something. They don't want, and you'll give meaning to it and assume probably the worst based on whatever unresolved stuff you're carrying a little bit of from the past. And then if you don't express it, you sit with that and you ruminate and you stress. And then within, 2-3 days, or maybe less, maybe 2 or 3 hours, the fearful avoidant will blow up about something seemingly random because they're carrying this in their heart. So again, you need to question these things. You need to speak up about them. You need to be vulnerable and say that this is what you're afraid of or what you're experiencing. And the last point here I really want to make is for healing, and I guess it's sort of congruent to what I've just been saying, but you really want to share as much as possible, whether you're the one dating this attachment style or whether you're the one that is this attachment style. Because the more transparency and the more connection, sharing, and vulnerability that is present in this relationship, the faster the patterns will heal and you'll get back into a really healthy space in the relationship. And as this individual, you can really heal and change the attachment style if you're committed to questioning your stories, to opening up about your fears, and to sharing and being more vulnerable. So I hope that's helpful. I could go into a little bit more. So please feel free to ask any questions below if you have further, deeper questions. But thank you so much for watching, and feel free to visit www.personaldevelopmentschool. Thank you.